of management as well. So before I pass the microphone to Kelly, let me introduce, also explain the rules of the game. So we're going to let Kelly present, and at some point, probably after the first 10 minutes, we're going to start taking questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, please type them in chat or raise your hand. We will see how well we're going to be able to manage this. So we'll start taking questions probably after 10 minutes, and then ask a few more questions as the presentation goes. And there will be more room for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So as this, I pass the mic to Kelly. Kelly, thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much to Andre and Nuri for organizing all this, and thank you to all of you for coming. This is actually really fun for me because I've been stuck at home and I'm eager to talk to other people and discuss some research. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And let me just make sure I can turn on my chat so I can see everyone. Okay. So I assume you can see my screen, and then I'll just get started. So I'm excited to present joint work with Paul Goldsmith-Pinkham, who is my colleague here at Yale. And we'll be presenting some results relating to the gender gap in housing returns. One second. All right. Okay. So our research is motivated by this important idea that housing wealth is the dominant form of savings for US households. Housing is also quite interesting because it differs from other common forms of household savings, such as bank deposits, bonds, and stocks. In that first, it's an illiquid asset. It's also a heterogeneous asset that delivers consumption flows to these households who are investors. And further, most importantly for us, prices are determined through bilateral negotiation. So not everyone is a price taker. We're also motivated by research showing quite large gender differences in financial investment strategies, as well as preferences for risk and competition. And finally, we're motivated by this research on gender differences in negotiation. So this literature has shown that there really are quite large gender gaps in negotiated outcomes for wages and for product purchases, such as automobile purchases. And further, this literature has shown that these gender gaps in negotiation outcomes are quite persistent and difficult to train. So even among MBA students who have taken negotiation classes, there seems to be a pretty persistent gender gap. I don't want to say in negotiating ability necessarily, but at least in negotiation outcomes. So inspired by this literature, we're going to investigate how men and women differ in their financial returns on housing investment. We're using new data on 53 million US housing transactions across the US over the past couple of decades. And what we find just in terms of summary statistics is a very large gender gap in realized returns. Women earn 1.5 percentage points lower annualized unlevered returns on housing relative to men. This actually increases to a gender gap of 7.9 percentage points per year after accounting for leverage. And that's because the typical homeowner only puts about 20% down and takes a mortgage loan for 80%. So any raw differences in returns are going to be multiplied by almost 5 if we adjust for leverage. Next, we find that approximately 45% of this gap can be explained by gender differences in market timing. So women are more likely to buy in locations and time periods when the prices are low, and then to sell when they're relative. The women are more likely to buy in locations and time periods when prices are high, and then to sell when they're relatively low. So there's a gender gap in market timing. Couples actually also earn lower raw returns, even relative to single women. But the returns of couples are quite unique, and they're very, very sensitive to market timing. So if we condition on the set of people who transact in the same region and time period, then couples outperform single women and underperform single men. And I'll show you some results that show that couples have unique dynamics. So it's not that they're just midway between single men and single women. Rather, couples appear to be at a large disadvantage when they buy, possibly because they're constrained because they need housing for their children and they need to time the school year. And actually, couples do quite well when they sell. The next main result is that we find that the remaining gender gap, after adjusting for market timing differences, the remaining gender gap arises primarily from a gap in execution price. So what happens at purchase and sale? So we are looking at repeat sales of the same property, and we find that women buy for approximately 2% more and sell for about 2% less relative to single men. Women buy for more, so this could be because maybe women value housing more, but that seems to be an incomplete explanation because even though women buy their homes for more, when they sell, they choose to list for less than single men, and they still end up agreeing to even bigger discounts off of that lower list price. Okay? So in general, women get worse negotiated discounts off the list price at the time that they both buy and sell. Further, these prices and discounts, they vary with the gender match between buyers and sellers. So the highest abnormal prices occur when it's a male seller matched with a female buyer. The lowest abnormal prices occur when it's a female seller matched with a male buyer. Finally, we explore some channels that could also contribute to this gender gap. And what we believe is less important is what happens between purchase and sale. Now, in theory, it could be that men buy properties that are associated with characteristics or just riskier properties, and these riskier properties should naturally earn higher returns. It could also be that men invest more in maintenance or upgrades for their homes, and that can contribute to their higher returns. And I'll show you some evidence. It's not that we want to rule this out entirely, but that does not appear to explain the bulk of this gender gap that we're uncovering. All right. In terms of magnitudes and returns and in dollars, they are quite economically meaningful. So first, for a finance audience, we focused on the large gap in investment returns. For the typical levered homeowner, just the difference in returns annually is larger than the equity premium itself. It's also a fairly large gender gap in dollars. So if we were to do a simple back of the envelope calculation, let's consider a median house price of $200,000 and a holding period of 5 years, which is also the median holding period in our sample. Women would lose about $1,600 per year relative to men due to this disadvantage in terms of execution prices. That is about half the size of the unexplained gender wage gap of $28,000 per year as shown in Blau and Kahn's 2017 paper. By unexplained gender wage gap, I mean the gender wage gap that remains after controlling for education, industry choice, occupation, job title, etc. We also argue that this is an important contributor to the gender gap in wealth accumulation. So if we look at women with a median level of wealth in the US at retirement, they have about 70% of their net worth invested in housing. Again, if we were to do a fairly simple back of the envelope calibration, we can estimate that just because housing is such a large gap in housing returns, then can explain about 30% of the gender gap in wealth accumulation at retirement for single men versus single women. Okay. However, though, we are refraining from making any strong welfare statements for two reasons. So first is, this is a gap in returns among the set of men and women who choose to own housing. Okay? And we're not trying to make the case that women in general are worse off. In fact, there are a large group of men who are unemployed or low income who are potentially just priced out of the housing market entirely, and they're not going to be part of our scene. The other reason why we're refraining from making strong welfare claims is this is really about investment returns. Housing is an asset that delivers consumption flows. So it is possible that women derive greater consumption value from their homes. I'm going to show you some evidence that that may not be a complete explanation of the phenomenon. But again, there is both a utility and an investment return angle to this. Okay. In terms of the gender wealth gap in retirement, these are the differences in mean wealth pulled from the SCF for couples, single men, and single women at around retirement age. So what we see is, of course, couples, because there can be more than one earner, on average have higher wealth, but single men relative to single women have far greater wealth accumulation. This is wealth at the mean, which is right skewed. We can also look at differences in median wealth in retirement, and this gap right here for single men and single women is again the gender wealth gap in wealth accumulation, for which we believe housing contributes to about 30% of this. Okay. All right, before I continue, any questions so far?
We don't have any questions. Okay, here we have one. Do you also take into account possible roles of real estate agents who engage in the negotiation?
That's a great question. So yes and no. What we can do is we have codes for listing agents. Okay? So we can show that the gender gap remains approximately equally large after we control for listing agent fixed effects. Okay? So this shows that this gender gap is not caused by women matching with, on average, worse real estate agents. So real estate agents that are just associated with lower returns on real estate investing. What we can't rule out, and I think could be an important channel, is even if we were to hold constant the quality of the real estate agent, the interaction between that real estate agent and male and female clients could differ. So one example of this could be women are more likely to listen to the advice of their real estate agents, and maybe the advice of the real estate agent is not good because there's an agency problem, and real estate agents may value volume of transactions rather than getting the highest return. Okay, I see a bunch of other questions.
All right, the next question would be, does it matter whether it's a transaction between women or women and men transaction? To what extent this could be related to the gender of both parties in the transaction?
I will show you for each category of match, male, female, male, male, female, female, etc. Okay, so I will show you each of those. It does matter.
What gains of the property? Are women more or less likely to sell the property?
So I will show you, men have slightly shorter holding periods, but even when we compare homeowners with the same holding length on the property, there is a gender gap. So we don't believe this result is driven by, let's say, men are more likely to be house flippers, and house flippers have higher returns. And I'll also show you men and single women appear to display a bit of a disposition effect in that nobody seems to. Any other questions?
Do you take into account the timing of the purchase in individual's life cycle, which could be endogenous? And I assume that you control for age and the stage in the career of the person.
No. So we can control for the calendar time. We don't know the time within that person's life cycle. That said, in a separate analysis, we're going to start controlling for age and other demographics. Okay? So this is not about, we're not arguing this is a pure gender effect as distinct from other things that are correlated with gender, such as education, income, etc. This is mainly a descriptive paper, but I will show you that this gender coefficient is actually quite persistent. And once we can start controlling for many other observables, such as income, number of children, etc., somehow there still is a very large unexplained gender gap. Maybe I should go forward and take some more questions later.
Yes, so let's move on and then we'll ask a few more questions later.
Okay. Let me show you our data. We're using CoreLogic county deed records, of which we have approximately 53 million observations. We're going to restrict to arm's length transactions, and this is important because we don't want to consider handoffs or transactions among family members, and we also exclude refinancings. We have data on the sale price, property address, and names of the buyers and sellers on each transaction. Our data covers most US states from 1991 to 2017. We then link these deeds records to MLS property listings. Property listings data is slightly more skewed toward the recent time period, and there we have about 20 million observations. What's nice about property listings is we know the first listing date, and we're careful because we know that when people sell their homes and it doesn't sell very quickly, they create a new listing to hide the fact that this property has been on the market for a while. So we try to find the earliest listing date associated with each property sale. We also know the list price, and from the list price, we can calculate the negotiated discount relative to the list price. We know the close date, the sale price, and the listing agent. From the listings data, we also have the text for the property description. And that way we can tell if the house, if it mentions upgrades or renovations for the home. We're going to supplement this data with census data as well as demographics data from the American Housing Survey. In terms of how we identify gender and relationships, the deed record contains full names of buyers and sellers. This allows us to identify the number of parties on each side of the transaction. So one name would be single, two names are couple. And we also measure the probability that the first name is male or female following the algorithm of basically of matching to first names as recorded on Facebook. We assign gender for names when we're 95% certain that it's male or female. Otherwise, we're going to treat as unidentified gender. So through all of this, we are going to have some measurement error. Okay? One type of measurement error in particular is sometimes when it's actually a couple buyer or a couple seller, they'll only list one name, and that is typically the male name. Okay? So some of the couples that we observe may actually be single men. What we have argued, and we have a full appendix on this, is this should be largely a bias against us, but probably the best way to check that our results are not driven by measurement error is we supplement the county deeds records data, which covers over 53 million observations. We supplement that with a much smaller data set from the American Housing Survey. And their marital status and gender are measured with much, much lower error because gender is self-reported and marital status is self-reported on that survey. Okay. In terms of categorization, we categorize someone as single female if it's one person identified female, single male as one person identified male. Couples are two people with identified gender, and other is everybody else, including people we are unable to identify as gender, as well as institutions. Okay. Then we try to measure returns. So consider property I that was bought in year B for a price PIB and sold in year S for a price PIS. Okay. We're going to restrict our return sample to observations for which it's an identified female, male, or couples. We also require that the name, gender, and the family structure of the buyer in period B matches that of the seller in period S. Okay? This is actually quite important because we want to focus on transactions in which someone was a single person or a couple from purchase to sale. So in particular, we're not identifying our effect off of people who have been divorced or widowed. In that case, they would show up as a couple when they buy and a single when they sell. Okay, so those are not included in our return sample. After applying those filters, we have about 8.9 million observations for which we have the investment return. We can then calculate the realized annualized unlevered return according to this formula here. So this is the unlevered return. What people actually earn is typically a levered return. And that is because the majority of US homeowners, they buy homes using debt with loan to value ratios of 80% or higher. Further, this initial leverage is going to persist because amortization schedules mainly pay interest upfront. Okay, so I'll show you results for both unlevered returns as well as levered returns. All right, so here are some baseline empirical results. Okay, our regression technique is really very simple, and it's because this is just a descriptive paper. So our baseline return regression is we're going to regress realized returns on a dummy for whether the seller is female, couple, and then the omitted category is single male. Okay. In some regressions, we include controls, such as 5-digit zip code interacted with sale year month fixed effects. So this would be the remaining gender gap among all those who sold in the same location and time period. And standard errors are going to be clustered by zip code. So that's what we do to examine the gender gap in returns. We can also examine other outcomes such as differences in transaction price. And here we're much more concerned that, for example, women might like different types of homes, maybe smaller homes, larger homes, et cetera, than men. So what we're going to do here is we exploit repeat sales on the same house. So we're going to include a property fixed effect in our regression that holds the property fixed. And we're going to include other transactions, including those with unidentified gender. We're just going to put those into the other category so that we can better estimate this property fixed effect.
Kelly, there are a couple of questions
Sure.
that I would like to kind of read to you. So first, are you able to any degree to account for the rest of the family structure, children, any other children or other relatives living with the family? Or
we can't in our main analysis, which really emphasizes sample coverage, and it's because if we only have data from the deeds records and the listing records, we don't know family structure. I am going to show you results using a supplementary data set where we do observe family structure and number of children. And what we find there is more children is associated with lower returns for couples, men, and women. So children predicts lower returns. Actually, the impact of children on returns is actually the most negative for single people, single men and single women. It's about half the effect for couples, which kind of makes sense because maybe couples can share in that responsibility. However, even after controlling for a number of children, single women without children still greatly underperform relative to single men without children.
And the second question would be, do women have stronger location preferences? Are women more likely to buy, sell through women real estate agents? Do you think that might be playing some role here?
So on the second question, I don't think this is due to women being more likely to match with female real estate agents, because I mentioned before, we can control for listing agent fixed effects, which controls for any fixed quality differences across real estate agents, including ability, gender, etc. Okay. That said, it could be that the same real estate agent interacts differently with their male and female clients. And I think that could be an important part of the channel. Unfortunately, we just don't know exactly how we can't observe that dialogue. We can only view the outcomes of that. In terms of the location preferences, I am going to show you that about 45% of this gender gap is explained by gender differences in location and timing. We can call that a preference, we can call that differences in constraints potentially imposed by caring for children or other family members, but about 45% of this is due to location and timing differences across these groups. The other 55% is not due to, I believe, these location preferences, because we're going to compare those who transact in the same zip code and time period. Now, within a zip code, homes are still slightly different. So it could be that women are very particular and want to get one particular home, okay? And that type of preference can lead to weaker bargaining power, which reduces their returns, okay? Even that is not going to match with some of the evidence shown later on. And it's basically, once we look at very tight housing markets in which negotiation is replaced with auctions. So you would think that if women have very strong preferences for a particular home, if they're competing against other buyers, they could just outbid them, get the house, and they would have a lower return. We actually see that the gender gap approaches zero in very tight housing markets, in which there's likely to be an auction mechanism. Is actually much larger in non-hot housing markets, where there's probably more likely to be bilateral negotiation going on.
Okay, one more then. To what degree are you able to, again, this is kind of goes back to the preferences part, I guess, you know, distance to work. Is there any way you can control for how far away the property is relative to the place of work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure, and it could be, again, this goes into, there's a direct financial return on this investment as well as some consumption value. So that's why I don't want to draw welfare conclusions. It could be that women earn a lower return, but they have this convenience of less commuting distance to work, and they're willing to pay that price. All right, should I continue?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to show you mostly graphs. Almost all of these coefficients are statistically significant because we have such a large sample size. What I want to emphasize is really the magnitudes. So here we're plotting returns for couples and single women relative to single men. Okay? So if we just start with the orange bars here, so these are the second bars in each group. So that looks at the gender gap, women versus men in returns. So in terms of the raw gender gap, women are earning about 1.5 percentage points lower returns per year on real estate investment. As we move down, okay, what we're doing is we're controlling more and more for location and timing. Once we get to the bottom, we're including interactions for zip sale year month fixed effects interacted with zip buy year month fixed effects. So this is going to control very flexibly for both holding length as well as when and where people buy and when they sell. So what we find is, as we control for market timing, the gender gap shrinks. However, even after very detailed controls for market timing, there's still a very large gender gap, about 0.8% per year. Okay, so that's the gender gap between women and men. We can also think about the gap between couples versus single men. So if we look at the blue bars here, couples actually do the worst in terms of raw returns. Okay? So couples underperform single women. However, notice that the length of the blue bars is very sensitive to controls for market timing. So as we move down, once we got to the bottommost blue bar, we see that after conditioning on couples and single men who transact in the same location time period when they buy and sell, couples now outperform single women and they underperform single men. So most of the return disadvantage for couples is due to poor market timing. And again, this is not to say that any group fails to understand market timing necessarily. It could be that they face different constraints in when they buy or sell. This is a distribution of returns for couples, women, and men in terms of raw returns. This is at the 10th percentile, 25th percentile, all the way to the 90th percentile. So what we see here is that differences in returns for couples and single women relative to single men, they're very much driven by the upper half of the return distribution. Okay? However, the gaps are still there at the median, and it doesn't significantly reverse at the left tail. Okay? Also, this does not mean that the gender gap is driven by wealthy individuals or expensive homes. And this is because we're plotting this out in terms of returns. So you could own a very small house, very low priced house, and earn a very high return. It's among homes that earn very high returns that there's a very large gender gap. Okay. This is the density of unlevered returns by gender. We don't notice any obvious differences in, let's say, downside risk among any of the groups. If anything, what we see is that the couples distribution is the most compressed. So couples have, let's say, safer returns than the returns earned by single women or single men. We also find some suggestive evidence that I mentioned earlier of a disposition effect. So this is just zooming in on the density of returns near zero. And what we see is for all three groups, couples, single women, and single men, there's something funny going on at zero, and there's missing mass to the left of zero. So this suggests that all three groups are a little reluctant to sell at below their purchase price. Basically, people want to avoid selling at a loss. Next, we can start moving on to levered returns. So we see mortgage data, and we see the LTV at the point of purchase. Among those that we see mortgage data, what we see is couples are the least levered, and then single men and single women approximately have pretty similar levels of leverage. So they put a little bit less than 20% down. We also have this issue in which a significant portion of our sample, we're missing mortgage data. For these observations, these could be all cash purchases, or in fact, these could be levered investors, and we just don't observe their mortgage data. So what we've done is, in supplementary analysis available in the paper, you can look at our paper. We'll show you exact levered returns for the more recent time period when the data quality has improved. What I'm going to show you now is just, let's impose the same amount of leverage for all three groups. Okay, let's hypothetically say each of these groups took a standard 30-year fixed rate mortgage using the interest rate that was prevailing at the time of their purchase, and everybody put 20% down and they got an 80% loan. Okay? What happens there is, of course, all raw returns are amplified, which means differences in returns are also going to be amplified. As we move from left to right, we're adding more and more controls for market timing, but even there, after controlling very flexibly for market timing, women are earning about 3.7 percentage points lower returns per year relative to single men, if we assume that they took a leverage bet on their housing. We can also explore some heterogeneity and variation over the calendar time. So here we can see the gender gap by zip level demographics. So this is just the male minus female unlevered annualized return for each zip code divided by quartiles. There are a lot of numbers here, but what I want you to take away is there is some demographic variation. So in poor areas, greater fraction Black, less educated areas, more elderly areas, areas with more single women, which is correlated with poorer areas, the gender gap is larger. However, even among areas with in the upper quartile of house prices or income or education, there is still quite a large and persistent gender gap. This is, again, raw returns, but over time, indexed by the sale year. So these are realized returns. And what we see is the realized return exhibits large business cycle variation. So for example, if you chose to sell right after the recession, people earn lower returns. However, the gender gap is quite persistent, even in recent years. So this is not something that has been converging towards zero over time. Any questions before I move on to execution prices?
All right, so let me indeed ask a few questions from the floor. So first, are there any differences in the returns for primary residence versus investment properties? Perhaps one gender is more likely to hold investment properties.
I unfortunately do not know, and it's because we can't track investment properties versus primary residences. What we can do is in a separate housing survey, we can limit it there because there's a question for whether this is a primary residence, and we still find a gender gap there. In our main sample, we probably believe the bulk of these transactions are primary residences. We can't say for sure.
Okay. Presumably, the value of a house is affected by investment in the house, maintenance and repairs. To what extent some of your results could be driven by the difference in maintenance and repair? Because, for example, men could be just doing more of this before they resell the
It's a
house.
good question. I'm going to have a lot of evidence on maintenance coming up, so I'm going to defer that question.
Do you have data on rental rates? And if
We
so,
have
do you
not.
think, okay.
We have not checked that out yet. It's possible, and I think it would be interesting either way to see if there are gender differences in rental rates.
Okay. About divorce, property sales after divorce usually have a lower price given the emotions involved. Houses are mainly granted to the female spouse. Could this be one of the reasons why there's, female sales are lower, the returns are lower?
So I think it would be interesting to study divorces, but our current results are not driven by divorces, because when we compare single men to single women, we actually require that they be single from purchase all the way to sale. So we're actually excluding transactions in which it was purchased as a couple and then sold by a single person. So this is going to exclude divorces as well as deaths and separations.
So can you please speak whether the gender gap is widening or narrowing over the time? And
so if we go back to here, it's not obviously narrow. If anything, it's just when returns are high, the gap itself seems to be larger, and when returns are low, the gap shrinks. But it does not appear to be shrinking over time in a systematic way.
Right, thank you.
Okay, all right. So now I'm going to talk about the gender gap in execution prices. And we explore this because now we're going to compare transactions in the same location and time period. So we're going to see how much additional gender gap remains after we control for market timing differences. Okay, so this is the gender gap in transaction prices, and this comes from a regression in which the omitted category is single male, and we're going to control for property fixed effects, so we're going to exploit repeat sales, and we also control for county, year, month fixed effects. So this compares those that transacted in the same location and time period. So this is not about market timing. So we first look at couples. We find that couples, when they buy couples do very poorly when they buy. So they buy at about 3 percentage points more than single men in terms of purchase price. But as I alluded to before, couples have interesting dynamics, which is they do poorly when they buy, but they actually do quite well when they sell. So couples actually outperform single men when they sell. Okay, so they sell at about 1.5 percentage points higher than single men when they sell. If we instead look at single women do poorly at both purchase and sale. So single women purchase for about almost 2% more relative to single men. And even though they bought for more, they end up selling for about 2.5 percentage points less when they sell. The transaction price also differs depending on the buyer-seller gender pairing. So here we're just focused on single men and women matching with each other. The omitted group here, everything is relative to male seller matched with male buyer. Okay, so that's the omitted group down here. And what we see is relative to this omitted group, the lowest abnormal transaction prices occur when a female seller has matched with a male buyer. The highest abnormal prices occur when a male seller has matched with a female buyer. Given these results, you might wonder, is there evidence of some strategic matching going on? I mean, just given these results, what everybody should be trying to do if they were purely self-interested and want to make money is they should be trying to match against single women. And we actually don't see strong evidence of abnormal or strategic matching. Mainly, each group is slightly more likely to match with itself than other groups. And that could be explained by each group has a preference for a certain type of home. But other than that, we don't see strong differences from random matching. Next, we can think about list prices. Okay, so this is, again, looking at repeat sales. Omitted group is single men. And what we see first for couples is couples, when they buy, they tend to go after properties with abnormally high list prices by about 1.5 percentage points. When they sell, their list prices, that these are now the sellers get to choose, couples choose list prices that are very similar to what are chosen by single men. Okay. Next, we can think about the list prices chosen by single women. When single women buy, they tend to go after properties that are listed at abnormally high prices. Okay? Even though we saw that single women buy for more, when they sell, they choose lower list prices. So single women, when they list properties for about almost 2 percentage points lower than chosen by single men or couples. Next, we can look at the discount relative to the listing price. Okay, so both the listing price, you can think of that as the initial offer in a negotiation, and then discounts, this plays into the negotiation aspect of real estate transactions. We're measuring the discount as a list price minus some transaction price scaled by the list price. Okay? So if you're buying, you want a bigger discount. If you're selling, you're better off with a smaller discount off the list price that you chose. So what we see here, first for couples, is couples get worse discounts when they buy. Okay? So this makes couples worse off relative to single men. However, couples actually, when they sell, they end up agreeing to lower discounts than single men. So basically, couples, when they list, they don't like to offer discounts. Okay, so couples hold on to their list price. They're very strong negotiators when they sell. Single women get worse discounts at both purchase and sale. So when they're buying, they get lower discounts. Okay, when single women are selling, recall single women are already listing lower than everybody else, but they still end up agreeing to bigger discounts off of their lower list price relative to these other groups. The discount also varies by the buyer and seller gender pairing. So the base group, again, is male seller matched with male buyer. What we see here is the largest discounts off of the list price occur when it's a female seller matched with a male buyer. And the lowest discounts occur when it's a male seller matched with a female buyer. So this is kind of like a double whammy in that when women buy, they're already buying from properties that have abnormally high list prices, and they still end up getting lower discounts off of that list price. Okay, so all this begs the question, are women, single women, somehow rewarded for choosing to list at more attractive or lower prices in terms of faster transaction times? Okay. Um, and and what this is the distribution of sale days on market relative to the earliest listing date that we could find among the listings data. And what we see is not a whole lot of differences. Female sellers do sell approximately 3% faster. This is not a huge advantage though. So the median listing time period is about 40 days. So women transact on average of 1 day faster, and they lose about more than 2% on the value of the property in exchange for about 1 day faster transaction. Um, so, you know, it depends on how you value this trade-off, but they're not rewarded by much faster transaction. Okay. All right, any questions?
All right, questions. So do this occur in colder markets? Otherwise, should be competition among buyers.
That's a great question. I want to show you how it varies with hot and cold markets. Basically, once markets get heated up and we have auctions and bidding instead of negotiations, this gender gap goes away.
All right. Any evidence on the behavior of same-sex couples? I mean, do we have, you know, any interesting dynamics for those? I'm not sure how big sample you have for, you know, same-sex couples.
So it's hard. We're not sure. We are interested in that question, but we don't have the right data to study it, unfortunately. Right now, when we say couples, we just mean two people of any identified gender. It could be same-sex gender. The reason we've chosen not to highlight same-sex same-sex couples is that some of these couples may not be real couples. It could be two sisters or two brothers who chose to buy a home together, and we wouldn't know the difference.
Okay, does the effect vary across locations with higher percentage of single women, maybe large cities versus other locations?
Yes. In our paper, you can actually see variation across states and as well as by average demographics within a zip code. It does vary. It's mainly that the effect is stronger in poorer areas. And actually, one thing that's interesting is controlling for education. As average income rises, the gender gap actually gets a little bit larger. So, so it could be that without any additional education training, if you just have more money, these differences in negotiation ability actually get exaggerated. In areas with higher fraction single female, the gender gap is actually slightly larger.
All right, so let's move on to them.
Okay. All right, so let me now talk about some other potential channels. Okay, the key phrase here is potential channels. And it's because I would not view these as alternative explanations. So we're not claiming this is a pure gender effect unrelated to anything else that's correlated with gender. This is just what could be contributing to this raw difference in gender. Okay, so some of these other potential channels could be that men buy riskier homes with characteristics associated with higher returns. So what we can do is we can observe various property characteristics. And what we find is men and women do differ in the types of homes that they're drawn to. However, controlling for these property characteristics does not seem to have a substantial effect on the measured gender gap. Next one, and someone asked about this, is men may invest more in upgrades or maintenance. So why do men buy for low and sell for high? Maybe they buy fixer-uppers, fix them up, and sell for high. What we can do here is using the listings data, we can restrict our analysis to a sample of home sales. And the listing does not mention any upgrades or renovations or synonyms for those words. And we continue to find a very large gender gap in the non-upgraded sample. The other thing that we can do is we use data from the American Housing Survey, and that collects data on how much each household is spending on maintenance. Okay? And using that survey, we find no difference in dollar maintenance amounts. So it's not that single men are investing more dollars in maintenance. Okay? It could be, of course, that single men invest more of their talent and experience fixing up their homes instead of hiring outside labor. This is not going to rule out that channel. But in terms of dollar maintenance amounts, there's no gap. Next is, it could be that these are demographic characteristics associated with being female, which is women are more likely to be older because they outlive men on average, they have more children, they have less education, etc. So here we're going to use data from the American Housing Survey. What we find here is that there's a similar gender gap after controlling for demographics. Having children predicts lower returns really for everyone. But being female on average is similar to a single man just having 3 additional children. Last explanation that we explore is women may employ worse real estate agents. Okay? What we can do is we can start controlling for listing agent fixed effects. And we find a very similar gap after controlling for this. So this means that our gender gap cannot be explained by anything that is constant about an agent across different transactions. Okay? So this can't be explained by agent education, agent gender, or agent fixed ability. However, and this is something that I would love to be able to explore, we just don't see these interactions, is the same agent may interact differently with male and female clients. So this could work in 2 ways. The agent can just think, oh, I should offer this different type of advice to my female clients than to my male clients. So the agent is assuming something about the preferences of his or her clients. The other thing that could be happening is agents can give the same advice. One advice that I think agents give all the time is, oh, you should list your house at a low price because then you'll have more interest, you'll actually end up selling for more. Actually, empirically in our data, I would not say that that is necessarily good advice. Seems like those that list abnormally high end up selling abnormally high. But let's suppose this is bad advice. Well, male and female clients could differ in their tendency to follow the real estate agent's advice. Again, we unfortunately can't see that dialogue between agents and clients, and that could contribute to this gender gap. I'm also going to show you that potential channels 1 and 2, so this is basically the risk and maintenance channels, are inconsistent with the variation by holding length and market tightness. And in the interest of time, let me just jump there now so that we can have more time at the end for questions. All of these detailed results and tables are in the paper in case any of you are interested. But I'm just going to jump to the analysis having to do with holding length.
And just a couple of questions maybe now, if you can. So how about agent-owned properties? Do females who represent themselves in real estate transactions also underperform compared to males who, generally speaking, or male who represent themselves as well?
That is a good point. So we've done the opposite of that, which is look at all the ones for which we can observe listing agents and control for the listing agent fixed effects. We haven't done the subsample analysis of suppose we see no listing agent, is there still a gender gap? That would be interesting to explore.
Again, one more. Transaction price is measured with the error. For example, a seller paying closing costs is probably not reflected in the sale price. Any reason to believe this measurement error could be correlated with gender and contribute to the gap?
Yes. So I guess the transaction price is a noisy reflection of the true kind of total price that people pay for a real estate transaction. If anything, I believe that if we adjusted for all of these other costs, the gender gap would actually grow larger. The main reason we believe that is we've started looking at the terms of the mortgages taken on by female versus male buyers. And one thing we found first is female buyers are much more likely to take 30-year fixed rate mortgages rather than adjustable rate mortgages. And at least over the past couple of decades, given that people move actually much sooner than they expect, on average, people would have been better off with these adjustable rate mortgages. So that's one way in which the gender gap would actually be more extreme if we adjusted for like the terms of the mortgages. The other thing is we've been looking at, so our levered return results assumes that everybody got the market interest rate at the time of the purchase. However, we've actually seen that women get slightly higher interest rates on their loans.
Thank you. All remaining questions will be taken at the end now.
Okay. All right, so let me just show you the two main pieces of evidence that I have left. And I think this is going to really show that it's about execution prices rather than maintenance or risk differences in these properties. So far, we've shown that women buy the same property for about 2% more and sell for about 2% less. So this is equivalent to women getting worse execution prices on real estate investment. We also know from standard finance that differences in execution prices matter less for returns for long-term investors. So for example, if we were investing in an S&P 500 fund and we plan to hold for 10 years, it really wouldn't matter if we paid a cost at the beginning or at the end for our overall cumulative return annualized. Okay? So drawing upon this intuition, we develop a simple framework. So suppose we hold for T years and let delta be the female fractional disadvantage in execution price. So this would be approximately 2% at purchase and sale. And let gamma be the gender gap in returns due to men investing more in maintenance or preferring properties with naturally higher returns. Okay? So this implies that the female annualized return will equal the male annualized return minus this term, which is going to be the gender gap. So note the effect of any difference in execution prices is going to be divided by T, the number of years in which the property is held. On the other hand, if men just buy riskier properties that demand a 1% risk premium per year, then men will earn 1% higher returns annualized regardless of the holding period. Okay? Here's what we actually see in the data. So this is holding length on the x-axis against the gender gap in annualized returns. And what we see is that it converges to 0, which is exactly what you'd expect if this gender gap in returns is caused mainly by execution prices. Okay? If it were due to men buying riskier properties, it should not asymptote towards 0. It should asymptote to, let's say, 1% if men buy riskier properties that demand a 1% risk premium. Of course, this is just descriptive. It could be that the types of people that buy at different holding lengths differ. But what we actually find is in this next graph, this is the gender gap in purchase prices among the by different holding lengths. Okay, so even among women and single men who hold for 6 to 10 years, women when they buy, they're buying for substantially more. This is the gender gap in sale prices. So from purchase to sale, this is the sale price. There's a very significant gender gap in sale prices, even among those who who hold for many years. However, if we put all of this together, it's the impact of any gender gaps in purchase price or sale price. The impact of this gender gap in execution prices gets divided by the holding length. So that's why once we look at people who hold for a long enough period of time, their annualized investment return they converge to equality. Okay? So this is the first piece of evidence that we think this is mainly driven by execution prices, differences across gender, rather than maintenance or risk in between. The other thing that we can do is look at variation by market tightness. So this is hot versus cold markets. So we're measuring market tightness following standard methods in the literature. This is the fraction of listings sold within each county month out of the all active listings. So in tight markets, multiple buyers compete in quasi-auctions. So bilateral negotiation should matter much less. Instead, the seller would typically choose the highest bid, possibly with some other considerations. What we find is that as the market tightens, the gender gaps in returns, prices, and discounts, they all shrink towards zero. So this is inconsistent with this idea that men buy riskier properties or invest more in maintenance or upgrades, because if anything, risk and property characteristics should be more efficiently priced in very liquid, hot markets. This is also inconsistent with a simple explanation in which women just get more utility from housing, because what should happen in these hot markets is women should say, this is the property I want, I'm gonna outbid everyone, and then they would get the property and they would earn a lower return in these hot markets, and we don't see that happening. Instead, it's really in these cold markets in which there's a large potential discount to be negotiated over that we see a very large gender gap. So this is all of that so this is the gender gap in, let's say, the coldest markets in returns, discounts, purchase price, and sale price. And what you see is as we interact with market tightness, all of these interaction coefficients have the opposite sign of what's in this row. And as a rough calibration, if we were to get to a very hot market in which all listings sell within 1 month, the gender gap has approximately approached zero in very hot markets. Okay. So let me conclude, and if we have time, that'll leave some time for additional questions. So what we've shown in this paper is just a very large gender gap in housing returns. About 45% of this can be explained by just differences across these groups in location and timing of purchase and sale. The rest has to do with execution prices among those that transact in the same zip year month. And we have a lot of evidence pointing toward gender matters for housing negotiation. So women buy for more, but they still list for less. So they start out the negotiation with a less aggressive offer, and they end up offering bigger discounts, especially if they're matched with a male on the other side. In terms of implications, we show that the gender gap in housing returns contributes quite substantially to the gender gap in wealth. What can women do? We don't unfortunately have many solutions. Women would be better off if they are able to hold for longer. On the other hand, let's suppose there were no transaction costs in real estate. This is one weird setting in which if you think you're good at negotiation, or if men are just good at getting good transaction prices, this actually pushes toward an advantage if you were to just churn more. Women would also be better off if they sorted toward tighter housing markets. Finally, one word of caution is we've shown that women have worse negotiated outcomes. This does not necessarily imply that women are doing anything wrong. So there's one version of this is to interpret as women don't ask, so they're not trying hard enough to negotiate. But there have been some interesting evidence, which is these are audit studies. Male and female auditors try to buy cars using identical scripts, but women still get worse outcomes even when they're asking for the same things as men. So let me end there and start taking questions.
All right, Kelly, thank you. There are a couple of more questions. So do you see gender difference in their FICO scores when applying for loan?
Yes, our data on FICO scores is very, very spotty. So none of these results have condition on FICO scores or interest rates. This is just assuming everybody gets the same interest rates. There could be something else going on with FICO scores.
Okay, here's another question. You may have shown that, but what results do you observe in the subsample of negative returns? Same gender gap, women lose more than men.
So among those with negative returns, men and women lose similar amounts. So it's not that, well, one version could be that men earn higher average returns, but they also have greater downside risk. We don't observe that. Okay? But the caveat to this analysis is we don't observe other associated foreclosure costs and costs of personal bankruptcy that could vary by gender. We just don't see those outcomes.
All right, any more questions? Because I'm looking at the chat and that's pretty much what we have for now.
If there's time, I just want to highlight one thing that this relates to, and maybe it'll spur some additional thought. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. What I wanted to talk about is how this relates to negotiation as documented in ultimatum games. So our negotiation in housing markets is not our standard type of negotiation, which we sit face to face and haggle over prices back and forth while talking to each other. Okay, so buyers and sellers rarely negotiate face to face. However, they are usually aware of each other's identities, and partly because they find out through their listing agents, and they're advised by listing agents who may be subject to agency problems. We believe that negotiation housing markets resembles most closely these outcomes in anonymous ultimatum games. Okay? So in an ultimatum game, and this has been done many, many times in the lab, so player one gets $10 and decides how to split that $10 between him or herself and player two. Okay? Player two then sees the offer and can accept the offer or reject. If player two rejects the offer, then both players get 0. Okay, so the rational course of strategy is player two accepts any offer, right? What we actually observe in the lab is offers below approximately $3 are viewed by player two as insulting, and then player two often just says we reject, and both players get 0. Okay? So this is kind of like splitting a surplus from a housing transaction. Solvit ran a version of this ultimatum game in which player one and player two do not see each other. They don't know who each other is, but each player's gender is common knowledge. And what this research found was that male player twos tend to attract higher offers from player ones, regardless of gender, but especially from female player ones. And further, player twos, both male and female, choose higher minimum acceptable offers from female players too. Okay? This is basically saying the same aggressive offer is viewed as more offensive if it tends to come from female players. And this is what we believe could be playing out in some of these negotiations, which is we see that women have worse negotiated outcomes. Doesn't necessarily have to mean that they're not attempting to put in aggressive offers, but for the same offer, it's viewed as more aggressive or offensive, perhaps, if it comes from women. And this reaction by the other side occurs if the other side is male or female.
We have a couple more questions. So do you observe any racial differences?
Okay, so race would be really, really interesting. In our main data set, we are unable to look at race without a huge amount of measurement error because we're getting gender from first names. And we can try to get gender from we can try to get race from first and last names, but it's just a more noisy exercise. What we have seen in the American Housing Survey is there we actually see race without much error at all because it's self-reported. the main thing that jumps out is Asians have very low housing returns relative to any other group. That could be because there are a lot of investment Asian buyers, and they may not even see the property on site, so they're probably not shopping very carefully. They're not searching very carefully.
All right, and the last question for today would be, do we observe lots of zeros in the distribution of discounts from listing price? If so, does the proportion of zeros differ by matched pairs?
Yes, so we do observe zeros. Zeros would be, we transact at the listing price and got no discount. And we do see more of that. We actually have these distributions in the paper in case you're curious. We see more bunching at zero when it's a female buyer. Okay, so this is consistent with this narrative that sometimes women don't even attempt to negotiate. But I don't want to conclude that that's true, because the woman could have tried to get a discount and the seller just didn't agree to it. But we do see more bunching at zero when there are female buyers. And we actually see less bunching at zero when it's female sellers to any other group. So the female sellers, even though they're listing for lower, they're less likely to stick with that listing price or willing to budge down.
All right, so thank you very much, and please join me in thanking Kelly for such an insightful and interesting presentation. Our next seminar is going to be a week from now, and we're going to have Margarita